I am so honored to present our next speaker, Dr. Glen Lawson. I met Glen through a friend, and that friend happens to be her son, who's also a doctor. But Dr. Lawson comes from Hamilton. She did her psychology degrees and PhD at McMaster University, and her career spanned everything from being a probation officer to a university professor to a clinical psychologist specializing in developmental disabilities and sexual abuse. As director of adult services at Surrey Place Center, she led programs in assessment, intervention, and research. As a mentor and advocate, Dr. Lawson continues to inspire the next generation. The reason why she's here is to give us a wonderful, retrospective, kind of looking forward in her vast experience in this area. So her presentation is called A Retrospective, Remembering Rightly Together. Thank you, and here's Dr. Lawson.
Oh, that's good. I'm so short that I sort of worry sometimes whether I'll see over things. Thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and converse with you, and I find all the things I see on the program of great interest. So I will try to add to things in some way. I have I think there's a picture. I think that I don't know if it's available. Oh, it didn't get put up. Okay, that's too bad. I'll tell you what. It was two pictures that I wanted behind me here, but I'll just describe them to you. One picture on one side is, you get me there? The one picture on one side is called part of an exhibit that was held in Dresden called in honor of the Angel of History, a painting that was done in 1925. The other picture on the other side is a picture from the cover of a very important film that was done and came out, I believe, about 1987, which was called To a Safer Place. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but when it came out, it was something of a sensation for those of us who are working in fields where sexual abuse was a good part of our work. The reason I had those pictures is because, on the one hand, the Angel of History is looking, in this one, in that picture, a photograph of the destruction of the city of Dresden in 1946, and looking back at history, and history has much in it that is destructive and debris. The picture with Shirley Turcotte, who is the survivor in To a Safer Place, is of her. She also has her back to us. She's got her arm around her mother, and she has one of the really incredibly awful stories about child sexual abuse. She also has one of the really wonderful stories about the amazing strength of a survivor and a thriver. She went on to do all sorts of wonderful things with her life, with her family, and she also went on to work and was probably one of the first people in a public way talked about in great detail about the great and terrible story of her childhood, which all sorts of abuse and neglect took place. I had them there because I very much feel like, in doing a retrospective, that I want to set the broad context that I personally work from, which is that, and many of you do, I'm sure too, which is that sexual violence is a form of violence, and it is a form that violence is itself a reflection of the abuse of power. that people who have power over us abuse us, or can. They can also be helpful to us, but violence and power go hand in hand. And so you look at the destruction of war, you're looking at power being used in this terrible way. And when you look at a child who has been abused from childhood on, or anybody who has been abused at any point, you're looking at this terrible abuse of power. And so we have to confront in ourselves and around us, I think, power, right? In all the forms that it takes. And that takes some personal work too, because we all can slip into some not such great places, or not great places. Remembering rightly is partly taken by me from a book called The End of Memory, written by a Yugoslavian, actually Croatian theologian who's now the head of Yale Divinity School, who wrote a book called Remembering Rightly in an Age of Violence. And what he has to say related to personal experience of being interrogated, he's not clear about how the whole nature of the interrogation, but he was a persona non grata in Yugoslavia in the communist time. He was a Christian. He was married to an American, very young man. He had to do his military service, and he underwent isolation, spying, and interrogation on a regular, terrible basis. And he responds to this in this book, and he wrote later about this again, that one of the things that he found, it was almost impossible to get the abuser out of his living room. That is, the abuser occupied him. He couldn't get rid of him. He called him, I think, Colonel G or something like that. And that the work he had to do was to somehow get the abuser out of the living room and at least into the basement, preferably in a corner somewhere where he might creep out, but he had to find a way to do that. And remembering rightly had to do not with being correct, although correct was important to remember truthfully, honestly, but to remember rightly meant to bring to bear on your memories those things that in some sense you had a right to, and human beings have a right to remember rightly. So just as an aside on the way here, and then I'll go into my retrospective, because the important part for me, I just want to backtrack a little, about memory is we remember in all sorts of ways. We remember in our bodies, we remember in our minds, we remember in our hearts and our souls, we remember together. And we need to remember together because, quite frankly, I don't remember anything. I was born in 1940. 6 years before there was pictures of the bombing of Dresden, debris was there, and I really don't remember anything about 1940. I don't remember a lot about anything up till on and off again there. So remembering rightly requires that we remember together, always, eh? So we're doing that here today in a conversation. I wish I were in a place where I could converse more easily with you, but I'll have to do it this way. I also want you to just let you know that I have glaucoma, and so I would normally use some notes, and I think if I use notes near, it will be a terrible experience for you and for me, because I'll be trying to look up and down. I can't, so I'll have to speak from something I've thought a great deal about and hope that I cover important things for you. Glaucoma means I can see, and I can see you quite well when I'm fairly close to you, but I have what they call the white fog, or the fogged window effect, which is that, well, I can read all these things here. I'm slightly looking through a fogged window. So please bear with me. To my side, I have the young man who drove me here this morning from quite a long ride, and I say this because the last thing he asked me was, what are you doing here today? And we had a long talk about his story, and he is a refugee from Afghanistan. And he was telling me, he was a lovely young man, he was lovely in terms, he understood, he was careful in terms of what he talked and what he talked about. We had a very long time to talk. And when I told him, just before we got up here, he said, I should stand beside you. Okay? and I could tell my story. But he said, tell them that you have to do the work, some of it yourself, and you have to educate yourself, and you have to not add layers, okay, to what's already been difficult, but try to find new things. And you have to not want to repeat the terrible things that have happened to you and other people's lives. He said, tell them that. And I said, thank you, Nazim. I think you were the angel on my shoulder. So in 1920, well, it could have been 1920, in 1960, I went to work in the summer as an intern at probation, juvenile and family court in Hamilton. And I then went to work again for a full year in 1922 when I finished, 1922, sorry folks, 1962, when I finished my undergraduate degree, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I just want to give you a brief snapshot, that's all I'll be able to do here, in this retrospective about what was happening there and how I felt about it and some of the things it meant for me. Juvenile and family court was, the juveniles were anywhere between 7 and 15 at that stage. It wasn't until the Family Law Reform Commission took place, and I believe it was in the early 80s, that new laws came in and children could not be in that juvenile court at the age of 7. Now, here's where I'm going to say, I may not get all of my dates correctly, but I hope you will bear with me that I get some things rightly. What was shocking to me as a young person, and I had a course in deviant behavior in sociology and cultural anthropology, and I heard in the Children's Aid Service, although I'm sure they were involved, but this was sort of the end of the line. And I remember distinctly watching an 8-year-old be picked up and put on a chair so that the judge could see the child over the edge of the dais, okay? I was charged with doing social histories. I was learning how to do that. I had a wonderful mentor, but I was mind-boggled. I'd already worked a lot with kids in recreation, other places, by seeing an 8-year-old, okay, in this position, and also that knowing that the 8-year-old then was going to go to a training school, because that's how out of control children who couldn't be managed either in the children's services or wherever, that's where they ended up going. And I didn't know at that point, personally, that often when those children ended up in those training schools, they became vulnerable to sexual abuse, okay? But I was already terribly upset to see them. They were just so little, okay? And the other group that were memorable to me were the young girls who were charged with being incorrigible. And they were often, they couldn't be placed easily in foster care if it was available because they were out of control. They were on the street, they wouldn't come in, and so on. And I was advised by a very good mentor, by the way, who took me under her wing, that a good many of these girls were victims of sexual abuse and, in fact, of incest. And in the course of my training, and I'll move on from this in one way, I also was taken by my mentor and with the approval of the judge, with his support, to see one of the girls' training schools in Ontario, which considerable scandal had emerged around even its construction in terms of financial finagling that was going on, but also to see what things were being held. That training school was shocking in terms of seeing where girls were being housed, if you want to call it that. They were cells. They were cells with doors, open toilets, metal doors. Somebody had tried to dress them up with curtains at some point. Hey? And we know now, too, that those girls in the training schools were often victims of abuse physical violence and sexual assault. Of course, there were good people who were in some of these places. I'm not denying that. But there was a vulnerability there, and it was shocking. So I stayed with that work. And one of the things I also had to do was, I was the only woman at this point, sometimes covering both adult court and family court, was assist the Justice of the Peace, who was a lovely, gentle man. When he had to swear a warrant, women had come in who were being violently beaten by their partners. And he was very polite, a very elderly man, and he did not want to look at their bodies. And I was asked to look at the bodies that were beaten below the neck. And often there was marital rape involved. So it was an eye-opener, and it was a difficult one. And I had good people, really, and a wonderful judge, actually, one of the things he said to me, I want you to read these books, and it had to do in part with policing and in part with police corruption and violence. And he was not saying, in ROMI, I knew a wonderful policeman who did great work with juveniles and with women, but there was also this piece, and he said to me, you have to be thoughtful about when you write a report or when you call things in for a warrant when somebody broke probation. So 20 years later, I had finished all sorts of things. I was raising a family, I got my PhD, I'd done a clinical research, I taught developmental psychology, adulthood and aging, by the way. It's interesting what isn't in textbooks, by the way. There wasn't very much about violence in people's lives, sexual abuse, in developmental psychology textbooks. I went to the adolescent and young adult team at Kitchener-Waterloo Hospital, worked in outpatient psychiatry, and I worked partly, sometimes on medical, sometimes did some crisis work. My main job, that was just in my internship, my main job was with adolescents and young adults. That's probably 14 to 21, 22. That was I was in a different place. I was trained as a therapist, I was trained in assessing, and one of the large presenting groups, known or unknown, turned out to be adolescents and young adults, both male and female, but usually more often female, who had either experienced child abuse or were now revealing the fact that that had happened, or were at university and were now revealing that they had been what we call date raped and indeed gang raped on occasion by other university students. So I was part of doing the assessment, and sometimes was involved in what was a disclosure, and sometimes was involved in trying to sort out what was going on, because sometimes when people present with a body memory, they present with a bad knee or asthma or something else, or they talk about being disembodied in some way, right? So it was a learning curve for me, a big one. And I had some wonderful colleagues to work with, and we were involved in sometimes alone, sometimes together in some cases. And I found there that, well, in the juvenile family court system, I was working often and seen more often to be seeing children who were poor and in what we call minority groups, or for example, First Nations children. In the case of in Kitchener, that was there too, but it was a different population in terms of, a lot of it in terms of being university students, college students, and actually older women who also got referred to me at some point, because now people were starting to talk, and that's one of the things that started to happen. This was why this movie was also so important. Now people were starting to really say, some things like this have happened to me. And some of those women things were 10 years out, some were 30 years out. Okay? They said, I want to tell my story. Okay? And of course, because there's such differences in ages and where people were and all sorts of things, what one could do and how one could do it and what one might be able to provide in terms of your discussions here today in Thriving were also very different, but they were also quite limited in lots of ways. The first shelters for women had only opened about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Some of them weren't even in all these communities. I worked on a committee at the hospital, for the 3 hospitals in that area, on violence against women. We got a grant which was used with the YWCA there to get some special housing going. I also relied heavily on getting in touch with colleagues in other places, including Toronto, which had more resources. In some ways, the Rape Assault Center, I think, had opened at Women's College Hospital in 1984. And I had actually a good friend and colleague from that time, I've lost touch with, unfortunately, but someone who I really valued. And I had spent hours on the phone with a girl that had a story not unlike Shirley Turcotte's of incredible child abuse, who now had addictions, and it was just a kid, right? Now had addictions, now was also testing HIV positive, okay? And could not find anywhere in Ontario that would take this girl, who obviously in every way needed to be in a treatment facility. And there wasn't anyone that would take her. Any place I contacted that had to do with addictions wouldn't take her because sexual abuse had to be dealt with, or somebody wouldn't take her because of the testing positive HIV. I finally got Dr. Barnes, who was here in Toronto, in touch with her, and she did a wonderful job at connecting me to a religious order, women who would take her, okay? And that was wonderful. I can't say everything turned out wonderfully, but that was part of the story. So the collegial things. And also, I got my first working with trans young people. I didn't really know, I hadn't training in that area. I got in touch with the Clark Institute and was told by them that I said, this isn't really my field of expertise. What should I do? And I said, there might be somebody in the community that might be better to do this. And they said, no, there isn't. So we're happy to work with you and help train you. And they did in terms of assessing. And I came to Toronto to do that. I then, in 1990, was hired at Surrey Place Centre to work specifically on sexual abuse in people with developmental disabilities. There was a program there Dr. Perlman was engaged with, and some of that work was actually to try to design or look at how to get adults or young people with disabilities, cognitive disabilities, to assess how they might be able to witness on their own behalf in the court system or give statements for discovery and so on. She did some fine work there. Anyway, that was a whole other experience because this is an incredibly vulnerable population, high rates of sexual abuse. Some have come out of residential facilities where they had long histories of abuse. Others were living in the community and needed more support. They were getting, despite the fact that they had some wonderful APSWs, adult protection workers who were doing extraordinary work, and Kathy Crow, who was a wonderful street nurse who was doing wonderful things. But also people with developmental disabilities who cannot talk or who are severely disabled were vulnerable to abuse in other institutions like hospitals. And so some of the most difficult work I had to do, and I hated it, but I hated it in the sense that it was just awful to do, but it was so stressful, I have to be honest. It's not easy sometimes to manage even when I had good colleagues and good support, but it was incredibly difficult work because it sometimes involved 2 legal firms representing 2 institutions and a contract that said what I could do and what I couldn't do. And it was stressful for everybody, the family and other people there. All of which I'm not wanting to emphasize, it sounds like it. I did that work and then became the Director of Adult Services, which meant providing services from 21 up until people died. And we had a wonderful and took some time, a wonderful interdisciplinary team who was psychologists, some medical input, nurses, service coordinators, audiologists, speech pathologists, and they did an incredible job on some cases that did go to court, where they were able, by virtue of having that spread of disciplines and ways of assessing and looking at people, they were able to present evidence and actually bring about convictions, okay? In some cases, but it was very slim pickings for being able to go. Justice cannot be done for many people, and it's going to be very difficult. It needs to be done, but it's difficult to do. Anyway, I think in terms of your work here, in terms of talking about thriving, I have seen wonderful and been incredibly inspired by all through my work, whether it was with probation services, with psychiatry, place, who have shown such spunk. One of the stories I tell is that I met one of these people in another setting when it was one of these difficult cases, and I was introducing myself, and I was asking them what their name was, and how would they like to speak? How would they like to address me? How would I address them? And so on. And the person called me a very vulgar name. And the nurses and doctors there all got quite upset. And quite frankly, I was rather pleased, because what I heard was that she was really mad. And she had some spunk. And she wasn't going to just go, hey? And that's an important piece. With all that, I've seen wonderful things that people have done. First Nations, young man out of a residential school who planted in a terrible, unyielding earth in the city, made out of laundry bags a beautiful greenhouse, okay? And grew wonderful plants. I've also, because of the period, and I look back to the war, heard many stories about women and men who had survived sexual assault as part of the war. And that's going on right now. We know that, Sudan and other places, and other places too. And it's not just, and when I say just, it's not women, and it's women and men, and we don't talk about it very well. In terms of coming back to memory, and I'll finish up, you can get to your break, it's important to get, when we get the abuser out of the room, however that's done, and I was happy to hear some of the creative work that's being done in the civil litigation here too, which sounds great. It's also that the room has to be, the living room to become one, and for someone to thrive, has to have other memories in it. And many people who have suffered from abuse have been so controlled that it's not only that they separate themselves out, become disembodied, their memories are in their knees or wherever else they may be, but in fact, they don't have good memories. They simply don't have them. It's not just a part of them's been exiled, they simply haven't had an opportunity to learn, to do things, to see beautiful things, to paint beautiful pictures, to listen to music. So I am very concerned that when we talk about thriving, that we include all of those things that people can do that don't cost a lot of money, that do mean we need resources, but means that they can go to the library and get a book, and it might even be one that talks about sexual abuse, right? Not be banned, hey, by the current authority. But they can go to libraries, they can get music instruments at school, they can paint. Some of the wonderful work done by the APSWs when I was at Surrey Place Centre was a wonderful one a worker who did artwork with some of our folks. And they loved it, and it was wonderful and creative, and it gave them new memories when they had been confined to very dark cellars in many ways in their own lives. So I'm not sure that covers all sorts of things, but I hope it gives you a bit of a sense that some things have got better. We're talking about this here together, and I'm very glad that that's happening, because it was not a great place for survivors to be, and it certainly wasn't terrific for those of us who are working in early days either. And I'm full of admiration for those survivors, but also for everybody who does accompanies them and is allied with them to make a better life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lawson. We're going to take the actual break right now. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, which means coming back here, if I got my math right, at 11:25. At 11:25. Thank you. 11:20, sorry. I'm really, really bad at math.
I hope